Are you thinking about selling your practice to private equity? Are you even curious about it? Well, my guest today helps practice owners with sales just like that, and he wants to give you what you need to be eyes wide open about it. I'm Carl White, principal at Market Advisory Group, which is a healthcare marketing agency, and I'm also the host of Practice Care. The mission for both is the same, and that's to help private practice owners stay private. Not only is that what they usually want, but care is better when the provider owns the practice because that's when they're going to have the most freedom to make the clinical decisions they think are best. It's different when somebody else owns the practice, whoever that may be, because eventually their agenda creeps into the provider's ear and there's more for the providers to deal with, takes away from patient care. Let's just kick all that out and help them stay private to begin with. My guest today is Christopher Spoerl. Chris is a principal with professional business management in the Chicago suburb of Barrington. He's a tax professional with particular expertise in individual, corporate, partnership, estate, and trust taxation, and an experienced certified financial planner. Chris and PBM are dedicated to providing services exclusively to small and medium-sized medical and dental practices and their owners, and they've been doing that continuously since 1932. Chris brings an in-depth knowledge of healthcare practice financial management, including startups, operations, terminations, buy-ins, and buyouts, and a lot more. Chris, busy guy, especially with tax season on the horizon. Thank you for taking some time to come on Practice Care.
Thanks for having me, Carl.
I've been looking forward to this one for a while, which is something I say to many guests, but it's a topic that's only getting larger. It's a complicated thing for practice owners to deal with. And so I'm looking forward to bringing some good information out there to everybody. But before that, I want to start with where I start with every guest. The bio I asked for from you is necessarily short. I'd like to get to know you a bit better, like our listeners to get to know you a bit better. So fill in the gaps in the bio. Tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I come into this industry a little bit differently than a lot of my colleagues do. I would just say a lot of my colleagues are, CPAs. They were accounting majors in college. If they went to graduate school, they might have gone and got their master's in tax. I'm a little different from that. I was a liberal arts graduate as an undergrad.
What were you? Me too.
Yeah. Well, and then after that, I got my MBA in finance, so it wasn't accounting. Still, it wasn't until after all that I actually got my CPA, then my master's in tax. And so I found that I view things with a little bit different of a perspective, especially from a business point of view, not necessarily just an accounting point of view. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit about me. PBM has been in business for 90 years now. Mm-hmm. And, we've exclusively dedicated ourselves to helping out medical and dental practices and have learned a lot along the way. And most recently, of course, is with private equity.
Yeah. Which is what we're talking about today. And I was thinking about it. It's not a new topic, private equity. It just seems like it's becoming like a bigger, more common topic. Is that your perception?
Yeah, really, it came on our radar probably about 7 or 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it turns out over the last 7 or 8 years, I personally have been involved with about a dozen private equity deals. And, I'm aware of many others that our firm has done as well.
Right. So let's get into it. And so we're going to kind of break this down into how a private equity firm determines a sale price, how pay works for the employee. In other words, the doctors who just sold, what their life looks like when it makes. So we're going to hit a lot of topics. And so listeners, we're still about bite-sized advice here on Practice Care. This might be a bigger bite. It's an important topic. Don't want to cut anything short. And so just kind of know that going in, but really relevant, important information. So let's start where everybody wants to know, what could I get for my practice? How does a private equity firm determine the sales price for a practice, Chris?
Yeah, that is more than a bite-sized kind of answer you're asking for, quite frankly.
Understood.
The first thing to understand with private equities, they deal in a concept called EBITDA, EBITDA, and that stands for earnings before interest, depreciation, taxes, and amortization. Mm-hmm. And that's slightly different than what we're dealing with in the tax and accounting world, which would be net income, okay? Mm-hmm. EBITDA is supposed to represent cash flows, and that's what private equity is mostly worried about, is cash flows. and it kind of approximates that. I mean, it's not exactly cash flows, but it approximates that. But that's
Okay.
what private equity is looking for: is how much EBITDA do we have here? So they'll look at your financial statements, and what they'll want to do is they'll look at the net income, and they'll say, okay, that's your net income. We're going to quote unquote normalize this. And what do I mean by that? Is they're going to make some adjustments to that net income to come to what they would consider a normalized net income figure, and then derive EBITDA from that. And so the
Why do they do that? Why do they take your actual net income that was reported to the IRS and say we need to change it?
well, that's a good starting point, because it's something they feel they can trust. Number one, if that's something that's been reported to the IRS, then it's something they feel they can trust. But after that, I mean, the adjustments they make are things like um, owner's salary is probably the biggest one. And so if you sell to private equity, understand that, the doctor or dentist is no longer the owner of the practice. A lot of the owners of the practice are used to, they get paid whatever is left over. And in the
Hmm.
private equity world, everybody is an associate who works for the practice. So everybody's going to get paid as an associate, including the person selling out. And so that's probably the biggest adjustment is, if you were
Okay.
making 600,000 as an owner, you might be making 300,000 as an associate. And if you were funding your retirement plan fully, it may be 65,000 a year. Well, maybe their retirement plan is only a safe harbor plan. Now you can only fund it for like 10,000 a year, plus whatever your 401k deferral is. You
Hmm.
know, other adjustments might be auto expense. You don't get to have as much benefit from that, or your dues, and so on and so forth. And so you'll find that the pay is going to be different as an employee than it is as an owner. And so, but that's the biggest thing that's going to change, the adjusted earnings, which again is going to change the EBITDA. It's going to make the EBITDA go up,
Yeah.
and that's going to get you a higher price. Well, that's great. Um, but it's what happens after that that's going to be the big issue for our buyers.
So the adjustment, just sort of conceptually, you are presenting to them a practice with certain costs related to you as the owner, right? But you're not going to be an owner once you have sold. You're now an employee, and certain of those costs change because you're an employee, not an owner. That's a lot of the adjustments that they're making.
That's right, and there'll be other adjustments as well, but
Sure.
the ones that are to the owner are probably going to be the biggest adjustments. Number one, and they're certainly the most impactful to the seller, after they make the sale.
Yeah. I'm just curious, do they look at other costs like, we would switch out this practice management system or whatever, and we get better costs on that. So is it, is, are there other big adjustments, I guess?
Well, yeah, they can look at billing systems or computer systems and decide, do we have to add to that, or is that going to be an extra expense? The billing system, that's going to change. It's always going to change.
Hmm.
They might normalize what, quote unquote, normalize, for they might decide they don't need as much in the billing department because they've got their own system. So there might be some, headcount reduction as a result of that.
Okay. Okay. And does the owner slash potential buyer, do they get to look at those adjustments and say, wait a second, you got to pay me more than this, or that's fine,
Uh, yeah, you know what? Let's talk about the stages of purchasing, okay? Because
Okay.
I think a lot of times what happens in these deals is that the process is really accelerated to the detriment of the practice owners. So normally what happens is, like, they'll be contacted, an owner will be contacted. Either it's a cold call, or it might be from a colleague who is going through a deal, and they might be actually incentivized to call up all their colleagues, their friends, their buddies, and ask them about selling out as well.
Hmm.
And so you start with that, and once you're contacted, what the private equity, what we found they want to do is come to a letter of intent as quickly as possible. And letter of intent is not binding per se, on the actual details of the deal, but it is, does describe the framework and of what the deal is. It'll describe what in the best terms, it'll describe what the selling price is and how that's derived. But it'll also almost always include, either together or separately, a non-disclosure agreement. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The strategy of the private equity is going to be, let's get you through the letter of intent stage, the LOI stage, as quickly as possible. Okay. And in so doing, they're going to have you sign off a non-disclosure agreement, so you can't disclose that you're selling or looking to sell, which is fine. I would also add that practice owners would be well advised to get a non-disclosure agreement from private equity as well.
Yeah.
Because what's going to happen after the letter of intent stage is you're going to give them all your information. Here's my QuickBooks files. Here's all the accounts receivable reports and the billing reports we have out of our system. Here's our employee bio information, all that information. So you need to get a non-disclosure agreement from them as well. Now, again, in the letter of intent stage, they want to kind of rush you through that. What sellers particularly need to know is at the letter of intent stage where you really get to talk about what's the framework of the sale. How is the sale price derived? Now, it's not fair to expect them to say, okay, here's the sales price, mm-hmm. and have it be and leave it at that. But they should be able to describe the process for determining the sales price.
Right.
And some of that would be, okay, what adjustments do you make to earnings? So we can figure out our normalized earnings the way you're going to do it. We can have our own thoughts about that.
Right.
Another one is, okay, you say you're going to sell at a multiple of EBITDA, okay? And so they derive EBITDA. Normally, there's some kind of multiple applied to that. What we found is that multiple is typically somewhere between, usually 5 to 8, around there. So, okay. For example, if you have an adjusted earnings of 400,000 and you've got an EBITDA factor of 5, you might be talking a $2 million deal. Okay. And so you should know these kinds of factors. Now, again, between 5 and 8 is typically what we see. We've seen it go up as high as 10 or 11. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think it really, I can't stress enough to have people slow down and not rush through the letter of intent. A couple other things, one other thing I should say that they should note is how long is that letter of intent good for? Because what that does is that kind of locks you into a certain period of exclusively dealing with this one, potential purchaser. Mm-hmm. Now, we typically see 90 days. We've seen them go out to 120 or 150 days. Now, understand a letter of intent, if it's got a certain period, you can always mutually agree to extend it if you feel like it. Mm-hmm. But you're looking for the shortest period possible in the letter of intent stage. So,
because you don't want to be locked up exclusively, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay. So let's keep going down the process. So that's been figured out. And now we get to the part about employee pay. So the owner, who's now going to be an employee of the private equity firm, how does their pay actually work? It seems like there's a lot of either misunderstanding or just lack of understanding about this. This is a big stage. So lay it out for us.
Yeah, understand that private equity is more interested in cash flows rather than, and I hate to say it this way, but patient care. They're not in it to make healthcare a better place. They're in it because they want to make money. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And that's not necessarily bad, but it also may not be aligned with the priorities of many of the sellers, and oftentimes it isn't. And so that's probably where we see things come mostly into conflict. Now, to answer your question about how pay is derived, oftentimes it's based on production, and understand also that once you sell as an owner, you've given the keys to the kingdom to the administration, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And the administration then determines the schedules. They determine how many patients you see an hour. And we typically see where, administration is booking more patients per hour than what's been done before. They may also take a different view of, key staff, and who you thought were key staff might get fired because they're just not deemed as necessary. I already talked about, billing staff may get reduced because they've got their own billing staff.
Right.
That could apply to others as well, even providers as well. Other providers that aren't sufficiently part of the program may find themselves terminated.
Hmm. And so I guess the answer then is the pay is determined. It's no longer determined by you. I mean, it sounds obvious when you say it, you just sold in this scenario, but your day may look very different from the day you used to have. And is it pretty much too bad for you?
Well, that's pretty much it. And a couple of reasons why that's the case. A lot of our sellers, or excuse me, a lot of our sellers are finding themselves locked out of the healthcare market, but for working for the buyer. And by that, I mean this. When you go to work for somebody, there's often an employment agreement, and there will be one in private equity deals. That employment agreement will have a non-compete agreement baked into that. Okay. Now, I understand from the attorneys, and we deal with many of them, that the non-compete agreements have been limited over recent years as to the amount of years, the amount of miles that you can restrict somebody from practicing around that practice. However, again, we've been told by many attorneys that doesn't hold as true for when you're selling a practice, and there will be a non-compete baked into the practice sale as well. And so we found non-competes in these deals that pertain to the sale of the practice that may be more like 5 years and like a 50-mile radius that will effectively eliminate people from practicing in the Chicagoland area. So you got to be very careful about that in your negotiations.
Yeah. And then I want to ask you also, and I bring this up because we had another guest a month or two ago. We were on a similar topic. It was more about the sales side, but in the context of, the transaction itself. So I'll make it up. Dr. X, we're going to pay you $9 million for your practice, but you're going to get 5 up front and 4 you're going to earn over the next 3 or 4 years as part of your employment agreement. And the point that this other guest was making was, well, sometimes that 4 turns out to be true and sometimes not. For example, it gets reduced if you miss production targets. You even hear some really bad stories about, production's based on 3 or 4 offices and then they close one of them, but they don't adjust there. All these things that who would predict this? Do you see that? I mean, that's kind of tied into pay and sale price, but do you see these things? And, how do you get eyes wide open about that?
Well, I mean, some of it, there is no seeing or no predicting on that, but you're right. There is, with any kind of sale, really the goal of private equity is going to be exactly the opposite of yours. You're going to want to get as much money out of it. They're going to want to spend the least amount of money on it.
Right.
So understanding that, obviously, the question is, what can you do? How do you negotiate that? And they're going to come to you saying, okay, we're going to give you, it's an $18 million deal. We might give you 10, 11, 12, whatever it is up front. We're going to give you some rollover securities. And we typically see rollover securities, easily be like 25% of the deal. And what are rollover securities? Rollover securities is basically stock in another entity. So, they're an entity, okay? They're out there and they're making these deals. You can invest in us, basically. And that's what these rollover securities are, is investing in us. And what we're going to do is we're going to sell to a much deeper pockets kind of entity, such as a pension fund or some hedge fund or another larger private equity for a much higher multiple, okay? And so these rollover securities, which are going to value it, in this example, might be 4 million, say. We think that's going to be another 5 years. That's going to be worth 12 million, something like that.
Okay.
And we've seen numbers like that. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
The unfortunate part I would say about that, not to get too far flung from your answering the rest of your question, but the unfortunate thing about that is we haven't seen many of those deals yet actually come to fruition where they
Sure.
actually sell. Actually, I have seen one where they actually bought out for cost, you
Okay.
know, but the next deal was never made, at least from what we've seen.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
That's first of all, but understand also that we're in a bit of a different environment for private equity right now because interest rates are higher,
Hmm.
and that makes it tougher for private equity to do deals. And so, they're going to want to, have much more in private equity, or excuse me, in rollover securities.
Yeah.
Um, but the chances of that getting resold at a higher multiple, that's diminished now that interest rates are higher because a lot of the quote unquote smart money is investing elsewhere. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, to answer the rest of your question, yes, I mean, you do have incentives a year or two or three even after the sale is made. If you hit these targets, we're going to pay you this amount of money. A lot of that is due because, you know, the, you know, the buyers understand that a lot of the value in a practice is wrapped up in the providers themselves,
Hmm.
oftentimes. Okay, and so they're going to want to keep you on board, through any kind of, a couple of years at least until they can go through a transition or have an opportunity to go through a transition.
Yeah.
And we've seen that happen too, where a couple of years down the road, one of the sellers, I think, one of our practices, 3 years down the road, one of the principals who sold was himself fired, and he's still
Right.
subject. By the way, yeah, he's still subject to the non-compete. So there's that risk as well. But again, I mean, you're going to want to probably, unless you're really somehow convinced that the rollover securities are going to be worth a lot, you're probably going to want to minimize that,
Hmm.
maximize the upfront cash, and then make the earnout something more reasonable because you have little control over that,
Yeah.
but for the amount of time that you work, amount of effort you work.
Right. Which leads us into, all right, so now you're in the earnout. Let's just keep going down the scenario. From what you hear and what you see, what's life as an employed doctor like when you've never done it before, you know?
Well, unfortunately, we've had a lot of complaints about that. I mean, I think I mentioned this before, schedules being loaded down,
Yeah.
you know, they're just, and it's not always about, oh, I'm working too hard. It's about, I don't have a chance to provide the care that I think I need to be giving,
Hmm.
you key staff being terminated.
Hmm.
And then they find a lot of times that management, the professional managers who come in don't know as much as they were led to believe. The sellers were led to believe they would know. But here's the thing about that part too, is I think a lot of doctors and dentists sell themselves short about how much they know about running a practice. And I'm not talking about, understanding all the financial terms and all that kind of stuff. And
Hmm.
private equity loves to throw that out there because it gives the impression they know what they're doing. And if you don't understand those financial buzzwords, then maybe you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
Now, they can understand all those buzzwords and all that, but what they don't have the experiences in the actual operations of running a medical practice. They don't have the same experience as our doctors and dentists do.
Hmm.
So they're actually rather surprised and rudely surprised that, gee, these managers are supposed to be professionals, but they just don't know as much as we thought we were led to believe that they would know.
Yeah. Is there a way you can question around that, like during the diligence? I mean, because, like what you said, you should get a non-disclosure also as the potential seller, which says, you can try to get some more, I guess, control, not control, but some more influence over it. Is there any practical way that you're aware of where you could say, so who would I be working for? I'd like to meet
Yeah,
them,
yeah,
assess them.
you can ask. I will say this, that the people you will be talking to are deal makers. That's what they do. Once they're done with you, they're not going to be, okay, now we're going to go in and run the practice. No, that's not their function. They go out and make the next deal. That's what they do.
But could I say to the deal makers, look, I want to meet the people I'm going to be working with every day and working for every day.
You can ask, and the answer to that will vary by who you're talking to.
Okay.
And so and it's probably not a bad idea to ask to get an idea about, okay, what kind of changes would you be making to my practice? You see what I've got here. What kind of changes would you be
Yeah,
making?
right. Right. I mean, if I were to go apply to McDonald's this afternoon, I'd get to meet the manager, you know. You'd
Right.
think why, why does it have to be so different? But I'm not in this world, so life is different on whatever it was conceived versus what you hear from your clients they're experiencing. It doesn't sound like it's on the whole better.
Well, yeah. Again, I think it goes back to what are your priorities as a practice owner versus what are private equity's priorities, and oftentimes they're different.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that it can make sense at certain junctures to actually sell out to private equity.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can think of two situations where this actually worked out. Situation one is we had a dermatology practice where the practice owner is actually a younger guy, but he flatly wanted to relocate. And
Okay.
so, he made the deal, and it did a great job in negotiating the deal with us too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he made the deal. He stayed on for 2 or 3 years, and then he moved, and that was it. And and that's good for him.
Mm-hmm.
We had done some analysis and found that you know uh, in his case, the maximum amount of dollars that he could make over that 3 year period, because that was his time horizon, was absolutely selling. And
Okay.
we do that same analysis to the second situation we had, which was retirement. It's an exit
Mm-hmm.
strategy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I mean, what's your greatest bang for your buck? Now, all we are doing in that exercise is figuring out what's your bang for your buck. We're not going to comment necessarily on what's your life going to be like the next couple of years.
Right.
That's something that you have to drill into and feel comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. It makes sense. And I was going to ask you, at the end of the day, it's a tool, right? Selling to private equity, it's a tool to achieve an objective, just like any other tool achieves any other objective. When does it make sense? So retirement makes sense. Moving away makes sense. Any other situations you can think of where you'd say, keep it on the table as an option?
It's funny because honest answer and the short answer is no. But I will say this: we had a situation with a cardiology practice in which private equity was looking to buy them out for some substantial amounts of money.
Okay.
Part of the deal that would sweeten the pot was they were going to set up some ancillary services. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're going to let the doctors participate in some of that
Mm-hmm.
in the form of a good sales price. And so we had, it was a group of doctors, and we had older doctors and younger doctors. And quite naturally, the older doctors looked at it as, okay, this could be a good exit strategy for me. And if it were just older doctors, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
But the younger doctors, they looked at it differently. It's like, well, what's life going to be like? I've got,
Yeah.
years left here, and 20, 15, 20 years left, and what am I stuck with living with?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that caused a lot of tension within the group. And so we started talking about it, and the end result was they did not take the deal. Um, and we're in the process of setting up the ancillaries because they figured out they could do it themselves,
Ah,
and
better.
they're going to reap all the benefits from that.
Yeah.
And then they're looking at the buyout that they have currently in place, and they're going to reassess that to make it more akin to what they would have gotten with private equity anyway. And they get all that without having to, live with the results of private equity.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the deals that we see, understand, I started this by talking about how, um, there's an adjustment to earnings, which will impact the owners in particular.
Yeah.
If you have salary and benefits of 800,000, and as an employee now it's 400,000, we often see that okay, that's a $400,000 difference there. Um, Over 5 years, you're going to pay back the price of what
Yes.
you got for the practice.
Yeah. That's
You
2
might have gotten
million.
$2 million in that deal, but 5 years later, you've paid it back, and you don't have a practice. They do.
Yeah.
So, from their perspective, they'll go to, residency programs and stuff. And they'll stock it with the fresh grads coming out
Mm-hmm.
practice, and you might not even have a job after that. So, um,
Mm.
I mean, it's something you got to look at very carefully before you go in it and understand what it is you want to get out of it and why it is you want to get out of it. And also, as part of the deal, what is it you can live with and what is it you cannot live with?
Elaborate on that.
Well, okay, so we had a situation where another dermatology practice sold, but they've been working with certain staff for a number of years. And as part of the deal, they made certain staff protected staff. You cannot fire these people for a period of a certain number of years that was determined to be as long
Okay.
as the doctor was going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So, you want to look at life like that and see if you can negotiate into the deal,
Mm-hmm.
certain things that will protect um, your way of life in the practice, if you will.
Right. I got you. Okay. Thank you
And
for
it could be
that.
things like production as well, and how that gets paid, and things like that, and how your schedule works, and when they can schedule you, and things like that.
Right. Right. I understand. Okay. It requires, a lot of predicting the future and knowing what might happen to the best that you can. It's really hard to do that, but and thinking about those things, because once the ink is dry, or as the ink is drying, it's your new life. So, you know, strap in because it's going to happen, and hopefully you've protected yourself. Um, Chris, this is great. I hope, I feel like, to me we've opened some eyes about it, and about what life can be like with a sale to private equity. And I say this to a lot of guests. We could keep going, and it's true for you as well. But in the interest of kind of bringing us home, two wrap up questions I ask every guest. The first one is, in the context of what we just went through, is there anything you think I should have asked you, or any other points you want to make that just didn't come up right and ask you about?
Yeah, we've had a couple of deals happen where the practice owners come to us and say, "Well, I've done this deal," and that's the start of the
Oh
conversation.
boy.
And there's really nothing we can do for them at that point. And invariably, those are the deals that are the worst ones for the doctors.
Hmm.
And if it's not us, go to your business advisors. Absolutely go to your business advisors
Yeah.
and make sure you include them in on everything. Frankly, our job is to make life better for our clients. And practice ownership is only one phase of our life with the clients. We
Hmm.
also are concerned with their tax situation afterwards, or their financial planning and things like that.
Hmm.
We want to make sure every phase of our client's life is something they want to actually participate in.
Yeah.
So make sure you include your advisors, because we will think of things, we've seen things that you will not think of.
Yes. Yeah. And, that bleeds into the next question perfectly, which is, the question is, so, we've got listeners, and we've caught their attention, and they've been wondering about this. Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? How does it work? Whatever stage they might be in, are there one or two tangible steps you would advise them to take? And I just want to build on what you just said about advisors. Um, in this space, please, if you're going to go find advisors, make sure they've got healthcare experience, a lot of it. And I would even say private equity experience on these transactions. There's just too many nooks and crannies. There's too much specific information. Um, I pick on my common example is an attorney. There's a lot of amazing business attorneys out there. You need a healthcare attorney with business experience. It's not the same. A general business attorney doesn't get exposed to the things that a healthcare attorney will. Same with an accounting firm, Chris. That's where you guys are. General business accounting firms. There's lots of amazing people. It's different. There's just things that you need to know that you don't see unless you've got clients living in this life. So as you build your advisory team, listeners, or if you do, make sure they've got healthcare experience, and in this case, private equity experience as well. I want to start us there. What do you think, Chris? And anything else you would advise them to do to kind of get started? Talk to some friends. I mean, what was their experience like? Because it's this big, huge deal. It's this big, important thing that you, the seller, it's probably your first time doing it. Nobody gets it right the first time. Especially on the other side of the deal are people who do it all day long. You got to level that playing field somehow. So any other tips, Chris, you think you would offer?
Well, the one thing I would say is I pick up on what you said regarding, nobody gets it right the first time or perfectly the first time. Because, once you sign the deal, it's done.
That's it.
It's done.
Yeah.
And, if that's your first time, you probably didn't get a lot of things right. And there's no perfect, sale or anything like that. Don't get me
Mhm.
wrong with that. But make sure it's going to work for you. And I absolutely like the idea of, talk to those doctors, dentists that have made the deal with that particular firm as well. So you can ask for references. That's true. You're going to get, cherry picked,
Yes.
examples, so that may or may not help. But if you can find others that have made the deal and see what they think about that company and life under that company, that might
Mhm.
help you as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's better if you can find your own references rather than those handed to
Absolutely.
you, right? Because they're going to be, of course, like you said, the most glowing, but it may not always be true. You need authenticity. Perfect. Chris, thank you. This is a heck of a topic. I find it hugely interesting. So thank you for coming on and shedding some light on it for us on Practice Care.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And a couple of other points, thank you, before we wrap up. Chris provided some contact information, which we will get into the show notes for the episode. So anybody wants to get a hold of him, that's another way to do so. If you are someone like Chris or I, where you seek to serve private practice owners and you've got some business experience on the business side of private practice to share, or if you're a private practice owner yourself, same thing, you've got some experience you think others would benefit from the business side of private practice, either way, we want you to come on Practice Care and tell the world about it. In the show notes for Chris's episode and every episode, there's a link, a couple of clicks, very quick and easy. Tell us what's on your mind so we can get you scheduled as soon as possible. And finally, we do a new episode every week on Practice Care, and the easiest and best way to stay up to date is to subscribe. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Google, we're on Amazon, we're on YouTube, we're pretty much everywhere, every major player. Subscribe so that as new episodes go live, you will be notified automatically. Thanks very much, and until next time.